Tales of sea monsters date back centuries. In the past, these beasts were often drawn on maps and included in scientific literature, and today appear in movies and books. Although these tales describe fantastical creatures that are not real, many of these stories were based on real deep sea organisms. Once scientists began exploring the ocean on dedicated research vessels like the HSM Challenger, and advanced robotics like ROVs and AUVs were developed, scientists began to piece together how these tales were exaggerated and misidentified some of the marine life that lives deep below the ocean's surface. Although they're often featured in movies, people today understand that sea monsters are not real. However, in the 14 and 1500s, sea monsters covered maps like the Carta Marina by Olaus Magnus and were serious concerns for sailors. The 1500s were a time where superstition was widespread, which only further enabled these tales to spiral out of control and be accepted as truth. At this time, the only information about marine creatures came from sailors, not scientists. Although they were experienced navigators and explorers, these sailors had no training or background in biology or anatomy. It's easy to understand how unusual and large deep sea creatures could quickly morph into tales of the kraken to the untrained eye. Due to limited technology, scientists were not yet able to explore the ocean and had to rely on sailors' tales for their information. Much of the early natural history describes what authors may have observed themselves, but also what they read about and heard about. As a result, European natural history books from the 15 and 1600s included a mix of real organisms and fictitious creatures from sea monster tales. Many reputable scientists during this time wrote about these creatures in scientific literature, believing that they were in fact real. The kraken was even classified as a cephalopod and given a scientific name in 1735. These drawings and books were then reprinted by other scientists for centuries. The more popular and widespread these tales became, the more factual they seemed. In the 1700s, sea monsters finally began to disappear from maps, and in the 1800s, scientists started to question the validity of some of these creatures. Henry Lee spoke for most scientists when he wrote that many classical monsters are not entirely myth, but instead distorted portraits of real-life organisms. In the mid-1800s, it was recognized that the tales of the kraken were not true, but instead were highly exaggerated and embellished accounts of giant squids. Although giant squids can reach up to 60 feet in length and would be intimidating to any sailor, they are not bloodthirsty beasts that intentionally terrorize ships. Many of the other extreme sea monsters were also later reclassified as real marine organisms. Leviathan, a demonic sea serpent, was most likely inspired by sperm whales, who can reach 67 feet in length and 125,000 pounds. Other sea serpents were realized to be oarfish, which can grow to be 36 feet long and serve as reliable predictors of deep-sea earthquakes and tsunamis, as they come to the surface before seismic events. It's reasonable to deduce that sailors mistakenly believed that the oarfish were purposely causing such events as opposed to reacting to them. Furthermore, basking sharks and even long pieces of seaweed in murky water could morph into sea serpents in the eyes of jumpy sailors. In 1855, zoologist J.P. Sternstrup suggested that the sea bishop, a sea monster described as a hybrid between a fish and a human bishop, was actually a large squid. The hydra, a sea beast with 9 heads that grow back when chopped off, was most likely based on octopi, given their tentacles could easily be mistaken as extra heads by fearful sailors, and they do have the ability to regenerate lost limbs. The few sea monsters that don't seem to have real-life counterparts are theorized to be animals that became tangled in fishing gear or other debris and dragged it as they swam, creating large abnormal silhouettes in the water. Correctly identifying and piecing together the truth of these tales would have not been possible without the field of marine biology. Charles Wyville Thomson was one of the first marine biologists to accurately describe deep-sea organisms. He traveled aboard the HSM Challenger, the first boat equipped with a laboratory and the needed tools to study organisms at sea. Having the tools to investigate marine life, scientists were finally able to recognize that many of these sea monsters were not entirely works of fiction, and based on real-life organisms whose behaviors and traits were highly exaggerated. Further advancements of technology allowed humans to investigate the ocean at incredible depths inside vessels. These types of crew vessels are commonly referred to as deep submergent vehicles, or DSVs. One of the first researched DSVs was Alvin, who's most famous for exploring the Titanic wreckage. One of the largest milestones in DSVs was reaching the bottom of the Mariana Trench in 1960. However, it was not until 2012 that James Cameron, inside the Deep Sea Challenger, a vessel equipped with the technology to explore the area, successfully made the very long journey to the bottom of the ocean and returned with a wealth of samples and data. DSVs have been instrumental in allowing humans to travel to amazingly deep depths, but the vast majority of underwater exploration is now achieved with controlled or programmed robots. ROVs, or remotely operated vehicles, were first invented in 1953. Dmitry Rybov created the first ROV named Poodle, and since then, improvements in lighting, photography, videography, and specimen collecting have been made, resulting in hundreds of successful dives. Although ROVs are fantastic tools, they must remain tethered to a ship, limiting their mobility, and they must be controlled by a technician in real time. However, the field of robotics rapidly advanced, and the first AUV, or autonomous underwater vehicle, was created in 1957, just 4 years after Poodle was built. These autonomous robots are able to be programmed in advance and do not need to be attached to a ship, offering an increased range and more flexibility. The ability to capture, observe, and study sea creatures and their ecosystems using crewed vessels, ROVs, and AUVs is what allowed scientists to study and learn about the creatures sailors hundreds of years ago misidentified and feared. Without this technology, the truth behind sea monster tales and much of what we know about the ocean today would remain unknown. Today, scientists know that the Kraken, Hydra, and Leviathan are not real, but nevertheless, tales of sea monsters still persist in pop culture. In 1870, Jules Verne popularized sea monsters in his book 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. In 1954, The Creature from the Black Lagoon and Godzilla hit the big screen, and both continue to make reappearances, with Ariana Grande revitalizing The Creature from the Black Lagoon with her Halloween costume in 2021, and the newest Godzilla movie, Godzilla vs. Kong, being released in March of the same year. Recent films, including Pirates of the Caribbean, The Shape of Water, and Luca, continue to feature sea monsters and increase their popularity. Although a small minority of people still believe sea monsters like the Loch Ness Monster exist, the vast majority of people acknowledge that they're just stories, and today's sailors don't worry about their ships being pulled into the ocean by the Kraken. However, tales of misinformation that are accepted as fact still occur quite frequently today. For example, in the early 2000s, there was a huge surge of false information about climate change. In the same way most people in the 16th and 17th century believed in sea monsters, the majority of people believed climate change was a hoax. However, over time, the overwhelming amount of evidence from scientists in the field has resulted in the majority of people recognizing that climate change is real and needs to be addressed. In the case of sea monsters, misinformation came from sailors. But today, misinformation comes from social media. Just like in the 1500s, false information often comes from people who lack the background and qualifications to correctly interpret or convey their observations. It's not uncommon for people to make claims based on Facebook posts or tweets their friends or relative posted, or incorrectly extrapolate conclusions from anecdotal evidence. To make matters worse, people often give these so-called sources the same weight as scientific papers written and peer-reviewed by experts in the field. For example, rampant misinformation about COVID-19, masks, and vaccines are spread as people make wild claims that exaggerate or misrepresent the truth due to a lack of knowledge and fear, just like sailors did hundreds of years ago. In the same way, the field of science grew to use a scientific method, verify information, and peer-review studies. Hopefully, the general public can learn how to recognize reliable sources, fact-check information, and learn how to interpret data that's on the internet. Sea monsters were certainly something to fear, but what's scarier is how tales of misinformation spread and are accepted so quickly, both 500 years ago and today.